Hello and welcome to week 3 of our managerial class. We are looking at product costing this week. It's going to refer back to chapter 17 in our combined book. If you happen to be using a single book, it is simply chapter 3 in our Wiley. So we're looking at product costing, which is a little different than what we did last week. Last week we did job costing. Job costing is where we want to figure out how much does one particular job cost from start to finish. And I accumulate all those different types of costs in one particular job. Like there was an example of a movie. I want to know from the director's fee to the producer and then the cameraman. I want to know all the costs, put them together, and give me one final amount that this whole, whatever it is that we're making, cost me. So I know a lot better about how much of a selling price I need to put. With this one, we're going to look at product costing where we're making mass-produced items. So we're not making individual unique jobs, and so we keep track of the cost just a little differently. Some things that, some new terms that you're going to want to know, and you're going to keep these in the back of your head because we will be talking about them as we go along. The first one is when we start putting together something in the factory, we're going to use direct materials, and we're going to look at those. And those are going to be called our material costs. So just the direct materials, which are the main items we use in making our product. So if it was a car, the actual steel and the leather for the seats, those would be our direct materials. Everything else that goes into the cost of making something in the factory would be considered a conversion cost. So that includes our labor and all the other factory overhead that could be included, which would be indirect materials, indirect labor, and then we just have regular factory overhead items like depreciation of a factory machine. And then our last new term that you're going to want to know for this chapter that we're going to talk about is equivalent units. Equivalent units is basically saying just because something wasn't counted as being all the way completed, like I have 10 items that I'm working on and 8 of them were transferred out because they're done, and then the last 2 were only 50% done, I wouldn't want to say that I only worked on 8, because that's not really true. I worked on 10 items. But if I wanted to know equivalent, how many items did I actually get all the way done, I would say, of course, I got the first 8. And then you're thinking, well, those last 2 items, if they're done at 50% apiece, if I would only maybe have worked on 1, I probably would have gotten that 1 done. So what we need to do is take those 2 items and then multiply by what percentage they are done. So those 2 by 50% is 1. So equivalent units, if I was making 10, I'd done 8 and it had 2 left that were half done, I would have 9 equivalent units that I had worked on. And that's really important when we're talking about school numbers, especially with Ivy Tech with a lot of part-time students. Schools get funded based on FTE, or your full-time equivalent. And it's a good thing they do that and just don't look at full-time students because we'd be missing out on a lot of money. Here's one of the examples, and this is somewhat accurate of a proportion, maybe even more so in the part-time, maybe higher numbers. But with this little example, I have 540 students who are regular full-time students. They take at least 12 credit hours. If we were only paid on them, we wouldn't get nearly as much money as we do when we look at full-time equivalent. Full-time equivalent looks at our part-timers and says, well, if you're only, in this case, taking a 40% load on average, well, some of you guys, we're going to include you into a full-time equivalent. So when you take those 680 part-timers who are at 40% regular full-time schedule, that's an extra 272 students that are going to be considered that like they're going full-time, even though they're really not. But all those students start adding up, and it's kind of like having 272 full-timers instead of 680 part-timers. So in total, Ivy Tech would get funded based on 812 full-time equivalent instead of simply 540 actual full-timers. So I wanted to do a little example here to kind of explain this more in the factory setting as well. Because in the factory setting, when we're talking about full-time equivalents, we're talking about how much materials have been added in for that product that's not quite done, and how much actual labor and other costs have been attributed but that isn't quite done yet either. And for the most part, when we look at this, materials are usually going to be added up front. So that's why these say 100%. And you have an example of this. You actually should have, let me think, I think you have 2 handouts in your resources in Blackboard. You're going to have an item, let me pull that up. It's here, this lecture example number 5. And this is the same thing that I'm looking at. It's just yours is a little cleaner, it doesn't have all the extra wording that I'll have, that you'll want to write those in most likely. We're going to answer these questions here based on what you have. We're going to be looking at and saying, all right, if I have this many to start out with at the beginning of the year or beginning of the month, I have started new items besides these 500. I started a lot of new stuff, 3,000. And then these guys are what I still have left that I haven't quite got done yet. And with materials, we're going to add those all at once, right up front. And that's usually how things work. Usually you get all the materials together that you need, and then you start massaging and getting all the materials worked out and refined, and then moving on to the next stage. So the materials, we're going to account for all of their costs right up front. Whereas with the conversion costs, the labor and any factory overhead, we're going to figure out the equivalent of what was actually done. If we have 400 items to fill an ending inventory, but we've completed over 75% of those, that's going to go into our full-time equivalent numbers that we're going to look at. So the first question that I ask you in your handout there is, how many items were actually transferred out that I had in my department and are no longer there? They've been moved on. For example, they went from sewing to, I don't know. I can't think of another department off the top of my head. But so we have 500 items that started. They were already there January 1, and they were partially done. It tells us here they were 60% done, and we just had to keep working on them. So in my little example here, we're looking at the flow, and I don't know if I have this mentioned, but I haven't mentioned it elsewhere. We're looking at wooden horses. That's what we're making. And of those wooden horses, we had all the wood already there, ready to go in our first area. Maybe it was the sawing area. However, we hadn't quite worked on all of those horses yet. So all the materials are in the room ready to be used. It's just we haven't completely done them. They're only 6% done. So that's our 500. And then we had 3,000 that we had started. Most of them finished. Of course, all of these would have finished and moved on. A lot of these would have been moved on as well already, because we only have 400 left. Out of those 3,000 that we started this month in January, we only have 400 still remaining. And of those 400, they're 75% done. The wood's already here. We've already got it 100% accounted for. So what we want to do first is figure out how many items did I actually transfer out. Well, if I had this many possible to transfer out, that's all the more I ever had to work on was 3,500 items. The 500 I started with plus the 3,000 that I just brought in. Now, if of those 3,500 I still have 400 left, that means that I actually moved on 3,100 items. The 3,500 minus what I still have in my first area of work in progress. So our first answer here would have been 3,100, of our transferred out items. The next thing I want to do is look at, okay, if I had 31 transferred out, how many equivalent units did I actually work on though? Now, 3,100 is the bare minimum. I definitely had worked on those. But what about these guys down here? Out of the 3,500, I still had some that I had worked on, partially at least. For direct material purposes, I worked on them completely. So when we're talking about equivalent units for material's sake, I actually worked on all 3,500 items. All 3,500 for material purposes have gotten everything they need, and I'm not going to include one other item, one other dollar's worth of stuff. So for equivalent units for material purposes, I worked on 3,500 items. For equivalent units For conversion costs, let me start pulling up some of my answers here. So here we are with the material equivalent units and our units transferred out. With our conversion cost equivalent units, well, I definitely had all 3,100, and I also had 75% of the 400 completed that were still in ending inventory. So I get to count those as items that are done, 75%. So that would be 300 additional units. So for material purposes, for conversion cost purposes, I worked on 3,400 units, 3,500 for material purposes. Now you think, well, why is that important? That's where we come down here now to step 2. This was step 1. I want to know how many items did I actually work on and what was the equivalent units of those items as well. Because we come down here to step 2, and I give you a couple little notes. Oh, let me back up one little thing here. When we talked about conversion costs, or with our beginning work in progress, these initial numbers here, we don't really even need them. We don't pay attention. What we pay attention to is our ending work in progress. I want to know, did I actually incur those costs this time or not? These costs were already done last time, but I want to continue them on. Remember, we carry those costs into the future, into the next department. So just because these say 60 or 100, I don't pay attention to the beginning work in processes. So try to remember that. Okay, step 2, I'm going to pull up your sheet again to kind of look at our final questions, what I want to get to. This isn't your sheet, but I still have it here. I want to know that for material purposes, how much did one item cost? Conversion costs, how much does one item cost? And then total, when I'm getting ready to sell this, I want to know how much did this item cost in at least this one department, if not together. So I give us a couple little pointers here as we're going. Direct materials, we're going to look at our total cost of materials, so whatever that would be, and then divide it by items transferred out plus the equivalent material items in work in progress. All right, so let's put that into, and actually, so it's a little easier to understand. So our first thing here is what is the material cost per unit? So remember, what I want to do is I want to find the total cost of the raw materials that were used. So in our example, I used 8,000 that was already incurred. Remember, I still had, back up here, I had 500 wood cutouts. Of those 500, that cost me $8,000 in raw materials. And then I added another 3,000 items this month. That was 50,000 of materials. So in total, I had 58,000 in materials. So if I use 58,000 materials, well, how many units did I actually work on? That's where we come back here, part B, and say, well, for material purposes, you worked on 3,500 items. Not just the ones transferred out, but how many did you actually work on? Did that 58,000 encompass? Well, that 58,000 encompassed our old stuff that we had already started, plus all the new stuff. Even though some of it may have not been done, we still had 100% of it. So when we look at our first answer here, what is the cost per unit for materials? We simply take that 58,000 and divide it over the 3,500 units that were the equivalent units for materials. So the 58,000 divided by the 3,500 units that I got up here in step 1, part B. So in materials, each unit cost $16.57. I do the same thing now for conversion costs. I had already paid $10,500 for last month's conversion costs. I paid another $74,000 this month, so a total of $84,500 altogether for this grouping. So if I take the 84,500 and divide that over the equivalent units that I actually have completed, back up in step 1, I spent $24.85 per item that was made. So total now, we just simply add those two up, the $16.57 plus the $24.85. So each item that I make costs $41.42 of factory actual costs. Now the final thing that we need to be able to figure is to actually start sorting some of these costs out. We've got everything we've done that we know. Now we just got to start combining some things. So my first question here is, well, how much of your costs were actually transferred out to another department? Out of all those costs that you, remember each item cost $41.42. So how much did I actually transfer into the next department or to the finished goods? Well, that seems to be pretty easy. All you got to do is go back up to our step 1, figure how many items were transferred out. We have 3,100. And then multiply it by our total cost per unit, which was what we just figured. So items transferred out, our costs, which we're going to be looking at how to journalize that in a little bit, was $128,402. Okay, how much work in process is remaining for our materials? So number of the ending equivalent materials times our materials cost per unit. All right, so our ending materials, well, remember there were 400 items, 400 equivalent units in our ending work in process, and we just calculated how much it is a piece for materials up in step 2. Conversion costs, we do the same thing. We had 300 equivalent units because they were 75% done at the $24.85 a piece. So total work in progress would have been about 14,000. Total costs, I rounded, we would have incurred about 142,000. 128 have moved on. We still have about 14,000 or so in our work in progress, our ending work in progress. So that's what I just answered steps B, C, and D. Now I have a second example that we generally will go through in class. I will make this available if you request it, but this will be, let's see, I don't know if I call it, yeah, I can make this available to you, and I believe I have it. So let me see, I think I do in my lecture example number 5. If you keep scrolling down, yeah, here it is, practice number 2. If you need the answers to this and want to check your work, please email me and I will gladly send this to you, the answers for this practice to finding equivalent units. Okay, now that we've found the equivalent units, I want to begin to look at how we're going to journalize this and how we're going to, it's kind of the difference between what we were doing last week with job orders and what we're doing this week with our process costing. So with both of the items that we were doing, the first thing you have to do is accumulate them in each of these inventory categories. All of your direct materials, your raw materials, all of your labor costs, and any factory overhead. You got to have those in each of their categories as inventory, as part of the inventory. And another thing that both items did is they both used, of course, raw materials. We're both going to use work in process, but the main difference is with process costing, as you see here, we're going to have a whole bunch of work in processes for each department instead of just one big work in process like we did last week. And then finally, we're going to move everything into finished goods. Okay, so the whole goal of what we're doing is I want to know how much cost did I incur this month for these products, and then all of those costs are going to be moved over into the next department, say from sawing to sanding. And all of those costs travel over. It's kind of like with dating somebody. all their baggage, their previous baggage just doesn't go away once you meet them. It stays with them, and then you add your own cost to that yourself, so they have even more baggage. That's kind of what's happening here with process costing. You keep adding and adding the cost until all of the costs are accounted for. All right, so what we're gonna be doing here is adding materials, adding in the cost then of our conversion costs, and then start transferring each of these items through work in progress. We'll come back to this as we get to it. I think the best thing now is for us to look at an example and then I'll kind of refer back to these different steps as we get to them in our process. So we have 8 steps here, and let's do that here with this practice. And this is the next practice that we have in your handout. So after your practice number 2, I have the journalizing a T account practice. Once we're going to look at some of you're going to need to have this printed off because here in a minute I'm going to have up an Excel sheet with the answers as we go through. And as you've seen maybe in past lectures, it's hard for me to go back and forth between a Word and an Excel document by showing it on the screen here. So I'm going to have simply my Excel up. And I'll refer back to this Word document, but you just won't be able to see it on the screen. So you'll need to have it printed out or off to the side on your own screen. One of the first things that we want to do is we need to be given some of our starting out information. And that's what I've done here. I've said before we even do one item for this month, because this is a business that's been going on for a long time, we have $10,000 in materials ready to be used before we even buy more stuff. And then we have 2 departments, as I have in my little directions, where we have a molding department and a decorating department. And I tell us that materials are added at the very beginning, just like they were for the wooden horses. So in my work in progress, in the molding department, I have accumulated $31,000 of costs. So that includes my materials and labor and factory overhead altogether. And of that stuff that's there, they're 60% done. I think it's 3,000 units. Okay, work in progress that are in the decorating assembly line. 50,000 in costs. They're 50% done. And then I have $94,000 in finished goods ready to be sold. Okay, let's start. And now we're going to be looking at, I'm going to be taking off the Word document and pulling up my Excel documents. The first thing that you want to have, and I hope you have this and have printed it out or have it on your screen, is this blank T account sheet. And I'm going to be making this and referring back to this quite a bit, but this is where we're going to start out. You should have a copy of this, and we're going to be adding, this is going to be our T accounts. These are all, well, at least these guys over here are all inventory accounts. Remember, we have a whole bunch of different inventory accounts as we move costs around. I'm going to pull up my beginning of my answers, and the first thing I want to do is start out my T accounts with their opening balances. And that's what I've done here. So the first thing I had on my my Word document, I'm going to pull this off to the side. Hopefully I won't interfere with the screen too much. The first thing that I show here is we had raw materials of $10,000. So I put that here as my opening raw materials balance. I had work in progress for molding of $31,000, decorating of $50,000, and then finished goods, a starting balance of $94,000. Okay, during the month, 17,000 units were started. We're going to come back to that. We don't need that quite yet. The first thing we need here that we're going to look at is we purchased $100,000 of raw materials. All right, so we need to be able to journalize that. I'm going to pull up my journal entry. We just bought $100,000 of raw materials. So this goes back to Accounting 101 days. I hope you remember your Accounting 101 material, because we're going to debit the item that what we got. We got raw materials, so we're debiting our raw materials. It's going to increase our inventory account. And it tells me in the problem here we bought it on account. It didn't tell us where, but it doesn't matter right now. We bought it for $100,000, so we owe $100,000 to somebody. Well, I need to go ahead and put that into my T account. Remember, I'm only looking at the inventory type items. I'm not concerned about the liabilities at this point in this course. So I'm going to simply put this in my inventory account. So I go up to my raw materials, and I started with the 10, and now I've just added $100,000 here in my step 1. So I need to put in $100,000 there. All right, let's move on to step 2. Raw materials were issued into production. $75,000 for molding, $21,000 for decorating. Well, so out of the $110,000 now of materials, I've now moved some of those materials into actually being worked on. And so I need to journalize that. I need to show that now in the molding department, I have $75,000 of stuff. But I just need to show that I've increased the molding department $75,000 worth. And I've also increased the decorating department by $21,000. All of it coming from my raw materials that I just showed here. When you add up the 75 and the 21, so out of that $110,000 that's in raw materials, I just took out $96,000 of it. Because remember, I had $110,000 in raw materials, my beginning plus what I purchased. Now I just took out $96,000. And that $96,000 was spread out between 2 departments. I added $75,000 to the molding, and I added $21,000 to the decorating. And we could add this together if we wanted to at this point, but we'll hold off on that for a second. So that was step 2 of my journal. Now step 3, I've taken care of adding new materials. Step 3, I've incurred labor costs of $90,000 for this week, or maybe for this month. It doesn't, whatever it is. I've incurred $90,000 of labor costs. Now notice I didn't differentiate that out yet. That's just pure labor. It could be our supervisor salary, it could be a maintenance, it could actually be a line worker. So it's both direct and indirect labor. And I'm simply, instead of calling this like we normally would wage expense and expensing it out, I'm going to expense it out later when I sell the inventory. But for right now, I'm putting it into an inventory account so I can keep track of the cost. So I put $90,000 into my factory labor account, just how I put some money into raw materials and then started spreading it around. I'm going to start off by putting $90,000 in my factory labor. Part 4 says, now we start issuing out that $90,000. Where did it go to? Well, of the $90,000, $65,000 went to molding. $25,000 went to decorating. Okay, so we need to divvy out these costs, put them where they specifically go. So of the $90,000 in factory labor, $65,000 goes to my work in process for molding, $25,000 to decorating. And they come out of that factory labor account. So let's go back. So here's my factory labor that I had. I added $90,000. And I paid it through some kind of a payable account, so I don't show the credit there because I'm not concerned about the liabilities at this moment. And now in step 4, I started taking that $90,000 back out and putting it in the different places that it went. And I need to update this T account, $65,000. So in my molding has $171,000 of costs accumulated starting with my beginning work in process, and then this month's stuff. And then decorating has an additional $96,000. Step 5, $250,000 has been accounted for various factory overhead costs. Okay, I need to journalize that. I need to show that, A, I got $250,000 into an inventory account that I need to begin to spread out here shortly, and then credit whatever that went to, whether it would be a wages payable for a salary worker, for a supervisor worker. Maybe it's accumulated depreciation part of it for depreciation costs. Part of it's going to be to pay property taxes, so that's why I had the account payable there. So you're going to have probably a whole bunch of credits to go with this $250,000 to start, $250,000 total. Now we need to start breaking this $250,000 out into each department. So that's step 6 here. Our manufacturing overhead, and this has already been predetermined, you'd have to be given this, but we need to allocate out, so max is applied $45 per labor hour, and I give us how much labor time went into each department. So if we had 4,333 hours that went into molding, simply just need to multiply that by 45 to know how much dollar amount of factory overhead should go into my work in progress for molding. And that's simply what I did here. 433 times $45. And then the same thing for the decorating. When you add those up, I took out $251,000 out of my factory overhead. I only put in $250. So that means I slightly over allocated. And that's okay. We're not going to have an exact because this is going to be kind of an estimate. Well, actually, both of these numbers are a little bit of an estimate. So let me. So we've now done the T accounts for steps 1 through 4. Let's look at our T account now for step 5 and 6. Step 5, I added that $250,000. Step 6, I've begun to allocate that $250. I actually over allocated a little too much, but it was pretty close. I put $194 into my molding department and $56 into the decorating. Now we've looked at the materials, the labor, and the factory overhead. So in the molding, I have $365,000 plus that I've accumulated, $482 in the decorating. Well, we'll get to step. We have to do step 7 first, but we'll have that $482. So let's look at step 7 real quick before we look at that closer. One of the things that happened. Oh, I see what I did here. Up through step 6, this was how much I had before I've done any transferring. And now it's time for step 7 to say, all right, out of some of the stuff that's in molding, a lot of it's done, and I've moved over to decorating. And then a lot of this stuff that's in decorating, it's done from before, and I'm moving it over into finished goods. And then some of the stuff in finished goods, I actually sold it. So now we're just kind of moving costs around, and that's what we're doing here in step 7. It says I transferred 16,000 units from molding at a cost of $330,000. So out of this 365, 330,000 has been moved on. And we'll explain a little bit how I got to this 330, or how you would if you were in a real job, by looking at the equivalent units. So we moved 330 from here, we took it out, and just simply entered it into our work in progress of decorating. All this cost, all this baggage got brought over to my decorating. So that was my journal entry for step 7. And then we do the same thing for moving things from decorating to finished goods. It said I moved $420,000 worth of goods from decorating, taken it out of decorating, and moved it into finished goods. Taking 420 out of decorating and moving it into finished goods. And then finally, sold 17,000 of goods at $50 each. And what I need to determine then, it tells us here, determine the cost of each item sold in the equivalent units. Okay, so we'll get to number 9 in just a minute. We need to be able to figure that out. So we need to determine equivalent units and items transferred out. All right, let's go back. Go back to my Word document for a minute. Well, let's see if we can do it without that, because I don't want to keep switching. I first want to look at our molding department. All right, so if we look back to our opening information, beginning inventory, it told us I had 3,000 units in beginning inventory. So this is going back to our equivalent units at the very beginning of this lecture. And then it told us during the month, 17,000 units were started in molding, so started from fresh. Okay, so 17,000 were brought in. And then at the very end now, it tells us I've transferred out 16,000 units. So in total, I had 20 ready to be worked on. If I transferred out 16, that tells me then what my ending number was. Even though I don't tell you in the wording, you could easily figure it out by knowing I had 20,000 possible to be worked on. And then it tells me in step 7 that of those 20, 16 were actually transferred. So that means 4,000 were actually still in ending inventory. And it tells us of those items, 60% were complete, or they were 60% completed. Okay, so now I can begin to figure out my costs as well by knowing how many units were transferred and what was my equivalent units as well. Well, for direct materials, all the materials were added up front. So of the 20,000, equivalent units is all of it, 100%. And then for the conversion costs, it said 60% were completed. Okay, so that means I had 16,000 for sure gone that I had completed. Add in another 4,000 at 60%, 16,000 plus 2,400. I got equivalent units here of 18,400. I'm going to need to remember that. That's equivalent units completed for my first process. And now I can finally go here to my direct materials per unit. Okay, so you have to think back, what was the total cost of my direct materials? Well, if I look back and my direct materials journal entry was number 2, 75,000. I brought in 75,000 of materials into the molding department. So 75,000, I'll put that in parentheses what I actually did. 75,000 divided by my equivalent units gives me the 375 per unit. Conversion costs. Go back up a little bit here. Conversion costs were my labor and my factory overhead. So if you combine those, 65 and 194. Okay. So 65,000 plus the 194,985, and you divide that all by the equivalent units, which was 18,400. That's how I get this answer of 1413. Going back to what we did, figuring out our cost per unit. Now these are going to come into play in just a minute. We're going to do the same thing for the second category, the second department. Tells us at the very beginning, in the decorating, I had 4,500 units. And then, if you'll notice, it tells me how many units I had at the beginning inventory, but then it only tells me how many units new that I started in my first department, molding. It doesn't tell me how many units I started in my decorating. Well, I kind of did down here in step 7 when I tell you how many items were transferred out of molding and into decorating. So I started out with 4,500. And then I added a new 16,000 items. And of that total 20,500, I tell us down here in step 8, of those 20,500, I transferred out 18,000. So that means out of the 20,500, if I transferred out 18, I ended with 2,500, and I tell us that they are 40% completed. So now I can do my equivalent units at this point. Of the 18,000 that were transferred out, all 2,500 were materials were used right up front. So all 20,500 for direct materials, equivalent units. And then conversion cost, 18,000 that I completely done, plus 40% that were completed already out of my ending inventory. Total cost, we do it just like what we did before. We take my direct materials, 21,000 of materials, and divide it by my equivalent units. So 21,000 in materials divided by 20,500. Conversion costs, take the 25,000 in labor, add in the factory overhead of 56,250, and divide it by my equivalent units, 19,000. Okay, one of my last steps now, not the last step, but getting there, is to do finished goods. Same thing. I want to determine equivalent units of finished goods, and then I want to determine actual total cost. How much did this item actually cost me in finished goods? Okay, so it tells me at the very beginning, if I look back to my notes, finished goods, I had 3,200 units. 18,000, that came from over here, the items that I transferred out from decorating into the finished goods. Notice I don't have a transferred here. What this is saying here is I had 21,200 possible items in my ending inventory, my finished goods. Out of that 21,000, if you look back now to part 9, the very bottom of my lecture example, number 5. Of those 21,200, I sold 17,000. So that means I still have 4,200 left. Now the cost for all of those items, well, this is what we need to do here, is say, you can do this one of two ways. Oops, sorry. You can say, come up here and say, how much stuff is in my finished goods? So what's that? $514,000 of costs. divide it up amongst all 21,200 items, which leaves me 2425. Or you're going to get real close to that if you add up these, but that's not quite the way we want to go because I did have some beginning inventory that isn't accounted for in our work here. That 94,000 was from a different period, and I want to be able to do this separately, so I need to add in that 94 plus this 420. If I didn't have any here and this 94 was not here, I just had the 420, I could simply add up these different equivalents per unit and have it would be the same. But with that extra 94 kind of thrown in there, can't quite do that. Now I know what the cost of items sold per item were. Now let's go back down to number 9. I can finish everything out. I sold the items for $50 each, which is a nice turnaround. It's about 100% profit. I sold them for $50 each, and I sold 17,000 of them. So 17,000, go over here to my sales T account now. 17,000 times $50 each, and you get $850,000 in sales. And I'm going to debit however I get the money, whether it's cash or on account, and then credit my sales revenue. Now the last item I need to do is my cost of goods sold. I need to show that I actually got rid of those items. And remember, those items cost me $24.25 a piece. So that's where I get this number. I sold 17,000 items, and what they cost me to make was $24.25, and I sold 17,000. So I need to take those out of my finished goods and put them into the cost of goods sold. Okay, that wraps up our new stuff here for week 3 with process costing. I know it seems like a lot, product costing. It really will help if you do the examples and then look at the Wiley Plus. In part 2 of this, I do have the Wiley Plus that I will go through to kind of help hopefully make some sense of a couple of the problems as you get to work on it yourself. Okay, I'll see you then, and then on to week 4.